All right, so in this section, we're going to talk about price controls. We're going to introduce price controls, and we're going to first look at price ceilings. But a price control is just a government-mandated minimum or maximum price. So minimum wage is an example of a price floor, and rent controls on rental homes and apartments is an example of a price ceiling, right? So maximum prices. So the reason these are named this way is because if you think about a room, right? If you're standing in a room, what's the highest that you could be? Well, it's at the ceiling. That's the highest that you could go in the room. So that's why we call a legal maximum price a price ceiling. And then, of course, the lowest that you could be in the room is the floor, right at the floor. And so legal minimum prices are called price floors. Now, as it turns out, when we have price controls that are binding, and I'll talk about what that means in a second, but it basically means that price controls that actually have an effect, it can lead to black markets, which is the trade of goods illegally, right? And so anytime we have a price ceiling, a maximum price that prevents the market from reaching equilibrium, that could lead to a black market, and that will happen if the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price. So this is where it could get a little confusing. So the price ceiling only matters when it's below equilibrium price, and hopefully you can think about that for a second and understand why. But I'll illustrate it in just a second here in a picture. So anytime the price ceiling is below the market clearing price or the equilibrium price, in other words, then we have a binding price ceiling. It actually has an impact, and it ends up creating a shortage. Okay, so we've talked about shortages already. Here's basically a government instituted shortage. All right, so let me show you what we're talking about here. Let me switch to my doc cam. Okay, so if we've got quantity over here and price, and we've got a supply curve and a demand curve, and we've got equilibrium price here. We've got our equilibrium. We go over to the price axis. There's equilibrium price. We go down to the quantity axis. There's equilibrium quantity. Okay, and then let's say that the government came in and instituted a price control, a price ceiling down here. Okay. Now the price wants to be up here, right? Here's our price ceiling. I'll put P max. Okay. Price ceiling is the maximum price. The price wants to be up here at P star, the equilibrium price. But the government says, well, we're not going to allow prices to be higher than this. Okay, well, this is going to be a binding price ceiling. The price cannot go above this legally, even though it wants to, right? It wants to be up here, but it's stuck in the room at the height of the ceiling, right? Now, what that does is at that price, here is the quantity demanded at that price, QD, and here's the quantity supplied at that price, QS, and of course that leads to a shortage right here. All right, so there's our shortage. And so basically what ends up happening is that you've got a bunch of buyers that are left unsatisfied. They're not able to purchase this item at the price, and they'd be willing to, but they're not able to get it, right? This isn't really as much of a problem for sellers. The sellers are able to sell everything they'd like to at that price. And so QS ends up being what is actually sold in the market. But then there's a bunch of buyers that are left unsatisfied. They're not able to get what they want. Okay. Now, if the price ceiling was set up here, I'll put Pmax 1, I'll put Pmax 2 right here. Okay, so if the price ceiling was up above the equilibrium price, this wouldn't actually do anything, right? The price naturally does not want to be up here, right? The price doesn't want to be up here. It's happy being right there at the equilibrium. So a price ceiling up here at Pmax 2 would have basically no effect. It wouldn't do anything. The market would just sit at equilibrium and be happy there. Okay, so that's what we call a non-binding price ceiling. It has no effect. It doesn't bind to that price. In other words. All right, so like we already talked about, there are non-price rationing devices, any method used to ration scarce goods that are price controlled. So a line would be an example, a queue, right? Same thing, waiting in line. And then, of course, again, a black market is just any time that goods and or services are sold illegally, whether it's because of a price control or otherwise. All right, so here's a very similar image to what I just drew, but another example. The only thing that is in this picture that I didn't draw is this orange vertical line, the implicit supply schedule. So when there is a binding price ceiling, the quantity supplied at that price of $600 ends up being the quantity that is available in the market. That's what's actually sold. Now, buyers at this price would demand a quantity of 15,000. So there's basically a $10,000, 10,000 unit shortage here. The difference between 15,000 and 5,000. So there's a 10,000 unit shortage, and so if you are able to get your hands on one of these units at the low price, the price ceiling, then you could feasibly take it and turn around and sell it illegally at a higher price, right? Because there are a bunch of buyers that are out there that are unhappy that they didn't get their hands on one, right? So you could sell it at a higher price feasibly. Now, what's the highest price that could be attained in this black market? Well, that's why we have the implicit supply schedule, right? So that's it's a vertical supply schedule, so it's kind of like the concert venue or the sports venue example we saw, where there's a fixed number of seats, right? Once the market sells 5,000 units legally, that's basically what the market is limited to, is those 5,000 units. And so if we draw that vertical line at 5,000 there, we can then see, well, what's the highest price that buyers would be willing to pay for that and buy all 5,000 units? Well, that's a price of $1,400. So that's the highest price that the black market could feasibly attain. All right, and so here's a real life example of this exact type of scenario, right? So so in Venezuela, there are these people called bacaqueros, I think is how you say that. And so this is exactly what the government did. They instituted a price ceiling. They established maximum fair prices from things like coffee to toilet paper. And as a consequence, these bacaqueros started emerging, and they worked together. So I guess I've never seen a video or anything on this, but I guess they work together like ant-like insects, and they coordinate together to quickly purchase all the items from store shelves at the government-mandated price as soon as they become available. And then they turn around and resell them at considerably higher prices on the black market. So very similar to what we're seeing right now with toilet paper and other items. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised, in fact, if there is some black market reselling going on with items like that right now. So, okay, so the function of rental prices. So now we're going to talk about rent control. So rent control is an example of a price ceiling. Now, the purposes of rent prices, the purpose is to promote efficient maintenance and construction of housing. Okay, so if there are no price controls, then again we end up getting to an efficient outcome. And with regard to rent, that entails efficient maintenance and efficient construction. It also allows the efficient allocation of existing housing. And again, it rations the use of housing so that people that value the housing the most end up getting it, and people that don't value it high enough will not get it. Okay. And so, well, what effects might a rent control have then in terms of construction? Right? If the prices of rental units promote the efficient construction of housing, how might a price control affect that? Well, here's two different cities, one that has a price control and one that does not. So, as it turns out, rent controls actually discourage construction, right? They're putting a cap on the price that people can rent at. And so that cap, since people are limited in terms of what they can charge for rent, there's not as much incentive to construct new units. So, for example, Dallas, which has no price controls, has a 16% vacancy rate. So 16% of all homes are vacant. And even though that's a relatively high vacancy rate, there were a lot of new rental units built, 11,000 rental units. Now, compare that with San Francisco, where there are price controls, a very low vacancy rate, only 1.6% of units are vacant. So this seems counterintuitive, right? You would think that, okay, there aren't a lot of vacant homes. There should be a lot of construction, right? That means that there's a need and there should be a lot of construction. But because of the rent controls, San Francisco only built recently about 2,000 new units. And it's because there's not a good incentive to build those units, right? These construction companies are looking at it and saying, okay, well, yes, I could invest a lot of resources and into building a unit, but I'm only allowed to charge this maximum price, and so because of that limitation, I'm not as willing to produce as many. Right. So this is really a question of supply, right? Of quantity supplied. It's just like in this picture here, right, where the quantity supplied at the binding price ceiling P-max 1 is low, right? So this is exactly what's going on. And then the vacancy rate being low is the result of the shortage. Okay. So there you go. There's the effect of a price ceiling in terms of rent controls. Now, this also has some other effects, right? This can have, that was with regard to new construction, but what about the effects on the existing supply of housing and current use of housing? So one thing that that rental controls do is that they prevent landlords from maintaining efficiently their current rental units, right? So it could be that a landlord has a property that could, if there were no price control, could rent for, say, $2,000 a month, but the rent control limits the landlord to renting it at $1,500 a month. Well, in that case, the landlord has no incentive to maintain the home. In fact, they have an incentive to let the value of it diminish so that it makes sense that it's rented for $1,500 a month. So this leads to a declining quality of the rental unit. Another issue that this causes is so-called housing gridlock. So this happens in New York. So in New York, when you enter a rental agreement and start renting a house, the rental price stays the same for as long as you live there. But as soon as you move, you're then subject to a new higher rent. And so basically this incentivizes people to stay put and not move, even though it would it might be better for them to move, and so it reduces mobility, and this is known as housing gridlock. Okay, so these are bad outcomes, generally speaking. And so, the political motivation for price ceilings is, well, we want to provide affordable housing, which, yes, that's a noble cause, right? We want to be able to give housing to people of lower incomes and provide affordable housing. But what we have to really question is it worth the negative effects, right? And in fact, would it be better to not have price controls so that we can incentivize construction companies to build more units, which would ultimately increase the supply of units? And when supply increases, we know that price goes down. So it's not really 100% clear whether these are good things for society. At face value, given our supply and demand model, it looks like they're not good for society, right? They lead to shortages, they lead to black markets, they lead to housing units that end up going into disrepair, and it prevents people from moving when maybe they should be moving. It would be more efficient if they were able to move, but they don't want to because they're afraid of facing a higher rent when they move. There's some other effects too. So forcing tenants to leave in order to charge a higher rent for the next tenant. In the case of New York, it can lead to tenants subletting their apartment. And it can also lead to basically the need for housing courts, right? So an entire justice system dedicated to housing issues that wouldn't be needed otherwise, right? So that's sort of a drain on our resources. As you can see, a bunch of negative effects of this price control. So who wins and who loses in the end? Well, the losers are property owners. They can't charge as high of a rent as they could feasibly without the control. And as it turns out, it actually ends up hurting low-income individuals as well, because even though the price is limited, there's a maximum price on rent, the units that they are able to get end up being very poor quality, and they end up having to stay in their apartment and they're not able to move so that they can maintain the current rent. And then, well, who does it help? It ends up helping upper income people, right? People who could afford to pay more in rent, but don't have to because there's a rent control. So even though, like I said, the purpose of having rent controls is generally to try to help low-income individuals, it actually ends up doing just the opposite. It hurts low-income individuals and helps higher-income individuals. So we need to educate politicians on this matter so that hopefully they can make better policies, right? All right, so just to wrap up this section, let's ask ourselves a question here to think about. What if the government required apartment owners to set rents based on tenants' income? Well, what would be the effects of that? There would be more low-income households seeking these rent control apartments, and as a consequence, there would be shortages in the market for those apartments subject to price ceilings, right? So, again, not a good outcome for low-income individuals. So, all right, that concludes the video lecture for Section 4. I'll see you in the next video for Section 5, where we will talk about price floors and quotas.